Okay, Tuesday night students, we're going to talk about the wisdom books. 5 wisdom books. The book of Job, Psalms, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, and Proverbs. Each of these books is unique in they're a separate, what we call genre. They're not history. They're not prophecy. They're wisdom books. So the first one is Job, and it's going to represent kind of a radical ancient book with regards to dealing with a question that's been around for ages, and that's the big question: why do the righteous suffer? Or more commonly, the more modern way of asking that question is, why do bad things happen to good people? So this book, Job, if you've ever heard it preached on a Sunday morning, is a very relevant and timely book, because it helps people, depending on how it's handled. You can help people who are suffering, dealing with pain and suffering in a world that's fallen, and help people understand how they're to properly and rightly respond to God. Here's our deep thought picture, and this is the one that illustrates the sovereignty of God, which permeates the whole book of Job, and Job's response and handling and overseeing, you might say, the experience that Job endures. You don't never lose track of the fact that the Lord is with Job, and that's another way of saying God's sovereignty is always behind the scenes. Now, I know a lot of you are probably familiar with the book of Job. The center of gravity would be, at the front end of the book, and we see that the thing that you need to know about Job is he's described as a righteous man. That does not mean he's never sinned. He's not sinlessly perfect. But in terms of his standing before God, in terms of you might say, a covenant relationship, he is presented as righteous. So I think it's safe to say Job is presented much like a patriarch. Let's say almost like Abraham. So it's before we have the details given to us at Mount Sinai, before the law, but yet Job is still able to respond in proper faith and fidelity before the Lord. The challenge that Satan gives in the situation is much like what we have probably in the original Garden of Eden. Okay, there's these people, they're well protected, but what would they do and how would they respond if I, shook things up a bit? God allows this to happen except for his health in round 1. We have that in chapter 1, verses 11 through 12. But then, round 2, we have the fact that Job loses everything at the hands of Satan. And how does Job respond in chapter 1, verses 20 through 22? He rises, tears his clothes, shaves his head, and falls on the ground and worships. So there's one who's faithful and righteous standing before the Lord shows up. And he acknowledges his situation before the Lord, but the author here gives us the theological high point that Job did not sin, nor did he blame God in anything, in any way, shape, or form with regards to his response. Satan comes back with round 2 and requests that even Job's health be taken away. And the challenge is that Job would curse God in response. And we have Job's response in chapter 2, verses 9 through 10, even after his wife encourages him to curse God. But in all of this, Job does not curse the Lord. And in fact, the big question in verse 10, shall we accept the good from God and not accept the bad? Which is really the translation, what it should say. In all of this, again, we have the affirmation, Job did not sin with his lips. So this is where we have in chapter 3 at the beginning of the response from Job's friends. I call them Huey, Louie, and Dewey, the 3 friends of Job. And they function somewhat as a therapy group for Job. Each one will take turns analyzing Job's situation. And their basic the basic foundation for their theology and how to deal with the problem of suffering is common to the ancient world at that time. The basic idea is that the gods punish the unrighteous and reward the righteous. So their basic response to Job when they look at his situation and analyze it theologically, through their very rigidly defined box, is that the gods punish the unrighteous. Job is being punished, ergo, Job must be unrighteous and needs to repent. So you have that advice, and I'll let you look up some of these verses on your own. The problem is with Job is that he was unrighteous. So they come back with more response, the friends, and they say basically, if it's not you, Job, that's unrighteous, then it must be your children. Or maybe Job isn't just fully accepting his circumstances, and the conclusion is the same. He needs to repent and allow God to change his circumstances. And really, the book of Job kind of blows the whole roof off of this ancient theodicy, or how to solve the problem of good and evil, in that it's not just the unrighteous who suffer, but in Job's situation, it's the righteous and the unrighteous who suffer alike. They're all thrown into the same potential for experiencing suffering and pain. And that raises the question, of course, how should one respond in a situation if they find themselves on the right side of suffering, you might say. One of the final friends for Job, Elihu, comes on the scene and puts a subtle theological twist on the whole thing. God speaks to us through pain. Job's been experiencing pain, ergo God must be warning Job of his unrighteousness. Therefore, Job just needs to repent. Of course, all roads lead to repentance. That's the right answer if there's ever any sin or any unconfessed sin. Let's look to see, though, the center of gravity for the book begins in chapter 38 when the Lord himself confronts Job. And one of the big things that we see in this text in chapter 38 is God reminding everyone around the table of who he is and who they are, and their inability to understand, you might say, the big picture, the divine vantage point. We have to, if you're ever in a situation where you're giving counsel to someone who's suffering and they're in a hospital, they're on their deathbed, you've been in these situations, the last thing that we want to do is just come to some rash conclusions, because we may not know all the details of this situation. You certainly don't want to go in, like I've heard happen before, and where you talk to somebody who's obviously in pain and suffering in a hospital situation, for example, and then some kind of disease that they're battling, and someone comes in and says, oh, it's just unconfessed sin in your life. That's kind of a similar situation to what we have with Job, and that's not what we want to do. Somewhat of a mystery, but God is who he is. He doesn't change. His character is the same, and he's behind the scenario. He's still sovereign in all situations. He's the creator of the universe and fully in control and in charge. So let's move to chapter 40, verse 1-2, and we see some things that kind of rise to the surface in the divine response. So in Job's response there in chapter 40, verse 1 and 2, one thing we can say, we can't see circumstances from God's vantage point like Job admits. So it's wrong for us to question God or to encourage others or even ourselves to find fault with him. The why question is really the difficult one here. We don't want to assign blame to God. Nor do we want to assigning blame is somewhat of the tricky thing, and that's not something that necessarily is our role to do. In chapter 40, verses 7-9, we see God, one of the things we don't want to do is make God out to be the bad guy either, so that we look good. Somehow it elevates our position. We question God's ability to handle the situation, thinking we can do a better job of running the universe and dealing with the sin problem than God. And in chapter 42, verses 2-6, we see the final confession of Job, which reveals the fact that, God's purposes, though they are hidden, they cannot be evil toward the righteous. That's entirely true. Though hidden and mysterious, we have to fall on the foundation of mystery sometimes. And that's what we see in chapter 42 there. Job finally acknowledges that. And what happens as a result, as you know, the full restoration and healing that's brought about from the Lord himself. The Lord restores to Job double of what was taken away. So just as a quick summary, there's some things that we can certainly encourage people with regards to difficult circumstances. One thing we want to say, if you meet up with somebody who's suffering, encourage them to maintain their integrity before God and the integrity with themselves. It's okay to be brutally honest when you're in a painful or suffering situation. The honesty is extended to the emotions that one feels. To lament or to mourn or to grieve or to cry, or all of the above, are true and entirely appropriate for someone who's trying to work through this. Also, withhold the temptation to assign blame or to try to fully understand the why. And then the honesty before God, as I kind of hinted at before. If you want another chapter to look at with regards to suffering, it's an interesting chapter, Romans 8, where you have the oft quoted Romans 8:28, for God works all things for the good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. But woven into this chapter is Paul's acknowledgement and teaching that it's written on the job description of every believer, every child of God, suffering with Christ. So it's not like we don't have someone who can identify with our personal struggle with pain and suffering, because the Lord himself, in his incarnation, experienced the fullness of pain and suffering that the world could dish out. And he's the one who we fall on and follow behind with regards to suffering with him. And that's an interesting thing. So there's no neutrality in a world that's fallen with regards to suffering. Everybody, righteous and unrighteous, could be possibly exposed to a world that's been subjected to futility by God, but in response to human sin. So sin is oftentimes left out of the mix, but sin is part of the equation of suffering. Sin, suffering, and experiencing pain. And what I've done in some of my research is woven in the idea of testing. The refining idea is certainly part of this, because certainly something that should emerge out of the scenario of suffering and pain and the experience of those things is that one's faith is either A, authenticated, or B, refined through it. So I know it gets a little hard to think about that, but that's something. And Paul writes, it's the faith that's on display that will be glorified. There's going to be a glorification step in our road to sanctification, and glorification is where that refined thing will be revealed and shown off, and there'll be a standing ovation and that kind of a thing. So there's this future that we have, the full acknowledgement and unraveling of the question of suffering, and righteous suffering leads to the final song that the Lord will sing in the new heaven, new earth, when the sting of death will be taken away, pain and suffering will be taken away, and we'll be in the full presence of the Lord. So that's the glorious future, and so there is where we have the final divine response, the once and for all statement that God makes. So we change gears now to Psalms, and Psalms is a book that is a collection over Israel's history. And despite the bad kings, the wars, the famine, the exile, there's always a group of faithful, the faithful remnant. Really, the book of Psalms is evidence that there's this faithful remnant throughout that whole time who are singing and worshiping and expressing faith and fidelity before God. And here is our deep thought picture. Singing palms or psalms. That's what we have here. Now, the book of Psalms is a large collection, and you might say it's got some sections that kind of organize different groups, groups of psalms or different kinds of psalms. We've got hymns of praise, which focus on the Lord, royal psalms, which have an interesting focus on the coming king, or the Messiah, the messianic psalms like Psalm 110. Psalms of thanksgiving, which focus on the fact that Yahweh provides in times of need, like Psalm 18. We have laments. Those are common for personal laments or over sin, like Psalm 51. We've talked about King David wrote that in lamenting his sin over Bathsheba. And then we've got more corporate ideas of lament, like Psalm 44, which talk about kind of a group lament over sin. So all of these are examples of the variety of psalms that we have. And as I've pointed out in class before, a lot of the psalms were attributed to King David and his means for conveying theology to his kingdom, as a good Deuteronomy 17 king should. Songs, good songs, well-written songs, as we experience, are very effective to help us remember truth and to engage both the heart and the head in a corporate or personal worship experience. Some of the psalms were written to commemorate or celebrate or focus on a specific significant event in history, like Psalm 126, a song that was written to celebrate the return from captivity. And you can see how helpful a song like this would have been for the group that came back out of Babylonian captivity after that 70-year period. When the Lord brought back the captive ones of Zion, we were like those who were in a dream. Verse 2, then our mouth was filled with laughter and our tongue with joyful shouting. Then they said among the nations, quote, the Lord has done great things for them. The Lord has done great things for us, and we are glad. Restore our captivity, O Yahweh, as the streams in the south or in the desert. Those who sow in tears shall reap with joyful shouting. He who goes forth to and fro, weeping, carrying his bag of seed, shall indeed come again with a shout of joy, bringing his sheaves with him. So songs like that would be to celebrate a significant event, in this case the returning exiles. Now if you read psalms, one of the things that we talk about a little bit is the idea of Hebrew poetry. In poetry we have the emphasis on the rhyming of the sounds of words, but Hebrew poetry is a little bit different. It combines, it focuses more on the logical connections of ideas, or the grouping together of ideas that are logically connected. So you can set up two ideas in contrast, or you can set up an idea A and an idea B, where B gives more information about A, or B sets up a contrast to the A idea. So Psalm 51, one that's familiar to us, is Psalm 51. Be gracious to me, God. That's the A idea. Then we have the B idea, according to your faithful love. And then a repeated B idea, according to your abundant compassion. And then the A, blot out my rebellion. And then there's some repeated A ideas after that. Wash away my guilt and cleanse me from my sin. There's a common pattern that sometimes you can see in Hebrew poetry is called an Abba pattern. A, B, B, A. So the little a, little b represents kind of a thought unit. A and B, and then you have the B repeated, and then A kind of forms the outside of a double patty hamburger sandwich. So lines A and A go together, and lines B and B to go together. So what you want to do when you read poetry, and in your English translation, you see that the poetry is lined up so that every line, how blessed is everyone, that's line A, who fears the Lord. B, who walks in his ways. B, when you shall eat of the fruit of your hands, you will be happy, and it will be well with you. Your wife shall be like the fruitful vine within your house, your children like olive plants around your table. So you can kind of get into a rhythm of how you read it, and in your mind, like the ancient Hebrews would, you'll hear the logical, what's called the parallelism of ideas. Listen for not the rhyming of words per se, but for the logical relationships between the short phrases in our English translation. And Psalms reading will increase exponentially. Now, David is to Psalms as Solomon is to the book of Proverbs. Again, common in the ancient world, kings would collect their libraries, fill their libraries with all kinds of different kinds of material, historical, but one genre of material would be called wisdom, or the whole wisdom idea. Kings would collect wisdom sayings or write down, in the case of Solomon, because of his gift, right, would write down wisdom sayings as well. And this was his contribution to the theological training of his people. Now, Hebrew wisdom is really about the skill in doing something, or you might say the intelligence, or a good moral sense, or a deeper understanding of the profound issues of life. So Proverbs, the basic idea of a proverb is a short, pithy saying that relates to a common experience that everybody could relate to. The center of gravity for Proverbs is really that you might think of it as an application book of the Torah. So Moses gives the big ideas. Book of Proverbs kind of comes along and puts feet to the individual ideas and makes it a little bit more practical with some things that are more relatable to the daily life experience, like managing money. That's one of the big ideas. Or how not to be a fool, or things like that. So we'll see. I'll give you a few examples here. And here's our deep thought picture. The wise owl, a fool and his money, which is one of the biggest teaching points of the book of Proverbs. How the book of Proverbs is kind of mapped out similarly to Psalms, but we have these first level subheads that show up in the book of Proverbs. We have the first collection, chapters 1 through 9 primarily, attributed to Solomon, son of David, king in Israel. And then we have the large section, chapters 10 through 22, are also Proverbs of Solomon. So a pretty good chunk there is attributed to him. The words of the wise are 22 through 24, and then chapter 24, a little collection there, also sayings of the wise. And then Proverbs of Solomon, which the officials of Hezekiah, king of Judah, transcribed. A section there, 4 chapters, 25 through 29 largely. And then 2 small sections at the end, words of Agur and the words of Lemuel, chapters 30 and 31. So that's how it kind of breaks out. The big thesis statement for the book of Proverbs, I'd probably locate there in chapter 1, there at the verses 1 through 7, right at the front end, and intentionally placed. We have the king, Solomon, letting his kingdom know the importance and significance of the Proverbs, the wisdom, to discern the sayings of understanding, to receive instruction in wise behavior, righteousness, justice, and equity, to give prudence to the naive, to the youth knowledge and discretion. A wise man will hear and increase in learning, and a man of understanding will acquire wise counsel. To understand a proverb and a figure, the words of the wise and their riddles. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. So that idea of the fear of the Lord, that kind of connects this whole experience back to covenant relationship, where fear of the Lord basically describes one's heart inclination or loyalty posture before the Lord. It was the same kind of fear that we saw back in Exodus 20:20 as the purpose for Moses' instructions, beginning with the 10 Commandments, in order that they would learn to fear the Lord. Now let's give some practical, let's look at some interesting proverbs just to talk about them, like chapter 15, verse 17. Now you read a proverb, you have to recognize that 1 or 2 verses at the most might be this kind of a self-contained unit. So for example, you're reading along and you have chapter 15, verse 17. It says, "Better is a dish of vegetables where love is than a fattened ox and hatred with it." That's it. That's the self-contained unit. So you may need to insert a little selah, one of those pause and reflect moments, to kind of digest what you've just heard. And that's, you think about it, and that's what you want to do. That's what the proverb is. It grabs you and it invites you in very quickly into a concept. And what the concept here, of course, is a dish of vegetables compared to the fattened ox. And then you have the contrast between love and hate. And you can apply that in a lot of different ways. So there's not necessarily a one right answer for the application, but in the interpretation, you've got the contrast between vegetables, which might be a more humble kind of home situation, a much, a moderate family, maybe even a poor family. But the most important thing about that family is it's a home of love. And you can have the fattened ox on your table, and the wealth and the Porsche car in your driveway, and the three-car garage, blah blah, and pool in the backyard. But the focus there has been on the accumulation of wealth, perhaps to the neglection of the children. And the opposite of love is hate in that instance. You can neglect your children. What's what's worse than being hated is to being ignored. So there's a lot to be said about that. The next verse, right immediately, so we're changing gears. Then you say, a hot-tempered man stirs up strife, but the slow to anger pacifies contention. There's all kinds of things you can say about that, but it contrasts the hot-headed to the one who's kind of even keel. And if you're putting together a team of people that need to work together, one of the strategies that you want to employ is finding people who can, people skills, getting along and working through conflict and aren't always reacting with a hot head to every situation that comes along. You need those even-keeled people. Verse 31. Now, there's all kinds, I've got this slide here, a lot of different short sayings that are out there, and some of them aren't in the Bible, but they're attributed to, say, Benjamin Franklin or some other person. But wise sayings are out there, but there's some that are in the Bible. And like 25:6-7, don't claim honor in the presence of the king, and do not stand in the place of great men, for it's better that it be said of you, come up here, than that you should be put lower in the presence of the prince, whom your eyes have seen. So this totally flies in the face of the whole climbing the corporate ladder, or trying to work your way up to the next level of, like, church, for example, place to serve. Know your role. The advice here is to seek to stay there as long as the Lord has you there. Otherwise, if you try to self-promote, it may be that the Lord brings a little humility into your life. And so that's kind of the wisdom here. If you go to the very last proverb, Proverb 31, this is the famous Proverbs 31 woman. And if I would translate the ideas that come out of this verse to a long list of ideas, you've got that long list in front of you if you're looking at the notes. The 5th century standard for the perfect woman: she works with her hands, she rises before dawn, makes breakfast for her whole family, which includes the extended servants and household servants. She buys and sells land from the money that she makes from crafts and produce. She's a night owl, and she uses her sleeping hours to do more work. In her free time, she has a side ministry to help the poor of the city, not to mention the fact that she makes her own clothes and the clothing of her family, using the finest of linens, of course. She's even able to enhance the job of her husband in some way. She has a side business, trading with merchants in garments and linen. She speaks in wisdom, always responds to difficult people with kindness. She uses every moment of her day for some productive purpose. She strives for being the best wife and mother in her community. And while she's not the most beautiful outwardly, she strives for excellence in an ever elusive inner beauty. So we feel, of course, under the pile when we compare ourselves to this long of a list. But what we have to do is apply our principles for interpretation. And there might be some timeless principles, and certainly because cultures have changed, there are some things that don't necessarily apply. For example, a lot of these things are basically centered around the basic idea that the reality back then, in that context, was that the household was the family business. So a lot of these things are just natural outflows of what it meant to be someone who could organize a household in that context. You're overseeing household servants and slaves. And your food production was and food harvesting and the crops, the caring for crops, and then the making of food from that took a lot of time. So how does that communicate to the Proverbs 31 woman of today? Well, one thing in my relationship with my wife, we've talked about this, and she's really good at the micro managing of our household funds, balancing the checkbook, for example. She's really good at it. She actually enjoys it. I have always hated that, but I also, my skill is the macro finances, the investments, the long-term things, the planning for college and getting our kids, applications in for the colleges that they want to go to and that kind of a thing. So it's just, we have different skills and abilities. So one of the practical things that you want to think about is the timeless principles. What's the big idea behind all of this? Well, each person in the household or in the family needs to know their role and be committed to that role based on their skill sets and abilities. It may not be that you do all things. Like I do a lot of the dishwashing and dishwasher loading in our home. It's therapy for me, and I actually enjoy doing it. Sometimes I'll help fold the laundry, but I don't put the laundry away because get mixed up whose underwear is whose. Especially if you have a lot of women living in the same household, I can't keep track of everything. So, honest admission there. But yeah, those are the kinds of things that we look for here. So, all right, let's pause there. Okay, now we're talking about another big topic, and it's a book that Solomon wrote near the end of his life. It's the book of Ecclesiastes. It's dealing with meaning. What's the purpose in life? What's the Chuck Norris meaning in life? Meaning life is Chuck Norris. Always have to throw in a little Chuck Norris joke. But it's a problem, and it's like the book of Job. It's asks a huge, big question. Instead of why do the righteous suffer, the big question is what is the meaning of life, or even more specifically, if life is unjust and God is just, then what is the moral value of life? A little different question than the world asks. There's a moral value to our life, not just what's the meaning of life. There's a moral, it's attached to the fact that there is a God who exists. So we ask the question slightly differently. The book introduces us to the Koheleth, or the preacher, who is a son of David, king in Jerusalem. So this suggests Solomon, I think it's right, looking back on his own life as an older man, but with some regret and some covenantally significant theological lessons for his kingdom. Of course, from Ecclesiastes we have the all is vanity idea. So how does someone define meaning in life? And normally people say, well, it's my job that defines me. It's pride in one's work and hands, and it's the identification that you are one of the best in your field or your occupation, or for some, experimentation with drugs or sex or the adrenaline experience, pride in educational goals or achievements, living in the moment, the existential moment. But his conclusion is announced first in the book. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. So what advantage does man have in all of his work, which he does under the sun? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. Also the sun rises and it sets. It hastens to its place and it rises there again, blowing toward the south, turning toward the north. The wind continues swirling along on its circular courses. The wind returns. All the rivers flow into the sea. If the sea's not full, to the place where the rivers flow, they flow again. So there's this recognition that everything has its place, everything has its purpose under the sun. Time ticks, time passes. You see one scene, and then a few days later it's the same scene again. But in the midst of all of this, why is it that human beings have a hard time figuring out what it is that they're supposed to do if we compare ourselves to all this that's under the sun? So the preacher here, I think it's King Solomon, attempts to basically put himself in his own place, and he says, look, I said the first thing that I tried to do was pursue wisdom in verses 16 and 17 there in chapter 1. Second, he turns to self-indulgence. Self-indulgence, there in chapter 2, verses 2 through 10, and all the things that he lists there, pleasure, what we'd call the hedonistic excesses, partying and all of this. And in verse 24, he communicates that it is nothing better for a man than to eat and drink and tell himself that his labor is good. This also I have seen, for that it is from the hand of God. But it's, again, in the vanity category. So he continues to talk about, and time is a big kind of overlapping theme in the book of Ecclesiastes. One of the things that's really interesting there in chapter 3, you've got the time focus there for the first 10 verses. And notice in verse 11, in the midst of time, the inescapable reality that everybody shares, time is ticking. And the acknowledgement, God has made everything appropriate in its time in verse 11. He has also set eternity in their heart, yet so that man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning even to the end. So what's interesting about that, eternity has been set in the heart of man, so that deep down everybody knows, everybody that you see on the street walking is wrestling with this time that's ticking. And to conflict with that, there's the sense, there's the inward awareness that there's eternity, the reality of what happens when I die. What am I supposed to do between points A and points B, that is birth and death, and everything in between has to have moral meaning to it, right? Question mark, they ask. So what advantage does it have for you and for me to know the Lord and to know that our life and our value has been defined outside of ourselves and by someone else? Not necessarily how successful we are at our job or how successful we are at pursuing things. And there's this eternity in our heart that can never be satisfied, but by only one thing, and that's to be connected with the Creator and King of the universe. So our deep thought picture here, this picture's Ecclesiastes, and it's the vanity idea that we saw at the very beginning, the breath, the emptiness, the wind, that which you try to grab and it just kind of vaporizes. It's the breath or the puff idea that Dr. Allen talked about in chapel not too long ago. And I've given you the words to this song. This was put together by a group of my students in a former class. Some of them may look familiar to you, but it's a great rap that they did and captures the essence of Van Komatsu's song that he wrote. Never didn't put to music, but then these creative students did later on, so I'm just going to play it for you right now. I'm going to restart it because I did it the wrong way. Here's the correct version.
Under the sun, I've had bundles of fun. Stacking silver to the sky, I've had bundles of funds. I've had hundreds of honeys in the numerous sums, and grub in my tummy, so the food was a ton. No function could sully or ruin my guns. My government money, was second to none. Flexing extraordinary wisdom, seating the highest. All the kings of the earth came to seek my guidance. If anyone said they were greater, they were telling you this. You could catch me on the latest version of Jerusalem Cribs. A passion for snatching the fly is fashion. My action consisted of grasping the cash and then flashing. I was sipping a tea, livid and living a dream, swimming in cream, brimming with greed, sinning extreme. The quintessential player, slick, suave, and savvy. Who else had 1,000 women who were calling him daddy? Vanity of vanities, coming through the speakers. Listen to me, children, I'm exposing my weakness. My goal is to warn you, my goal is to teach you, to come here and listen to the words of the preacher. Got my status established in Ecclesiastic 2:9. I was greater than any man before my time. Thought I was living the high life, blessed and free, till I realized my possessions were possessing me. Under the sun I've had bundles of fun, but the fun was misleading, it's humbling, son. The pleasures were fleeting, they're crumbled and gone. Now I'm severed and bleeding, asundered and numb. Forever fly, really I had always acquired whatever my greedy eyes had ever desired. But living in my passion brought no lasting satisfaction. Woman, fame, and gold was my sinful distraction. Vanity of vanities, coming through the speakers. Listen to me, children, I'm exposing my weakness. My goal is to warn you, my goal is to teach you. So come here and listen to the words of the preacher. Vanity of vanities, coming through the speakers. Listen to me, children, I'm exposing my weakness. My goal is to warn you, my goal is to teach you. So come here and listen to the words of the preacher. I've looked for every possible route or meaning and found it's literally impossible without the highest being. So I'm here to tell you that you need to be confessing, because without God, your life will be depressing. Money, fame, and woman were nothing at the end. Now all I can think about is what I should have done then. Live for your own glory and see how it turns out. Trust me, you'll regret it, that's no doubt. See, when the end is here, death is gonna get you. And when death comes and gets you, you can't bring anything with you. So what profit is the labor, walking after paper, scoffing at your maker? Sooner or later, the coffin's gonna claim you. Naked you'll return to the dust. Be wise in your words or hush. Because God is in heaven and he's a real stern judge. Don't live for one night stands and weekend plans, because the glory of God is the chief end of man. Vanity of vanities, shaping the statement of my thesis. Everything is worthless apart from saving faith in Christ Jesus. Vanity of vanities, coming through the speakers. Listen to me, children, I'm exposing my weakness. My goal is to warn you, my goal is to teach you. So come here and listen to the words of the preacher. Vanity of vanities, coming through the speakers. Listen to me, children, I'm exposing my weakness. My goal is to warn you, my goal is to teach you. So come here and listen to the words of the preacher.
They really did a good job on that. And there's the words to the song and the rap, and there it is again, so you have that. So the book of Ecclesiastes concludes, if we turn to the very last chapter, there in chapter 12, verse 12, "But beyond this, my son, be warned, the writing of many books is endless, and excessive devotion to books is wearying to the body," as we all know, being at college. But the conclusion, when all has been heard, is fear God, keep his commands, because this applies to every person. For God will bring all acts to judgment, everything which is hidden, whether good or bad. So this is the fear of the Lord, which is continuing to be the center focus of the wisdom material, whether it be Proverbs or Ecclesiastes. Now we have one more book to cover, and it is the next book that was prohibited to be read by Jewish boys under the age of 13. Now it's a hard book to understand, and it has probably been approached in your all's church background or church life differently. For some it's an allegory, or it might be entirely symbolic. Thus God is the groom, Israel is the bride, and the love described here represents God's love for his church. So I go a different direction than that. I think the book needs to be attributed to Solomon. And I think it can't be assigned to Solomon talking about his one true love. I think that what we have is Solomon near the end of his life, like what we have with Ecclesiastes. So while his pursuits of wealth and this experience and that experience was all futility, now he's giving us another look back and an evaluation of the fact that he got it wrong in relationships. Now what he's doing here is leaving us with the proper view of what a relationship should be about. And the big center of gravity with regards to the book is really about the celebration of romance. And I think he's probably writing not necessarily about himself. I don't think that's the case. I think Solomon is regretting the failure that he had in relationships, but he is writing about maybe a couple that he knows, or the ideal couple with regards to what's going on, and how basically a marriage or a relationship should celebrate romance. And we have the deep thought picture, the half-hearted king. I think this picture's wrong, obviously. I don't think he's talking about one single person, one of the many women that he collected over the years as being his one true love. I don't think that can be the case. But we have the one true love idea. We do have the book focusing on the one true love's kiss, and the basic message is the celebration of the love and romance between a man and a wife, from every aspect and development of their relationship, from courtship even into their wedding day, wedding night, the consummation of their marriage, and then beyond. So let me show you how this kind of breaks out in terms of the book. So the progression of the relationship, and I obviously have an emphasis here because we are a college. We need to get our facts straight. The attraction stage, there in the earliest chapters, in chapter 1, there's no sex there. Dating, chapter 1, verse 8 through 2:7. The courtship is part in that chapter 2, verse 8 through 3:5. The wedding actual event, chapter 3, verse 6 through 11. And then finally the wedding night is when we have the consummation of the marriage in chapter 4, verse 1 through 5:1. We have a conflict afterwards in chapters 5, 6, and then chapter 7. We have the celebration of romance, and then a reaffirmation of one's commitment there at the end of the book, chapter 8, verse 4 and following. So you see the progression here with regards to the all-important sex does not happen in the book until the appropriate location, and that's the wedding night and the consummation. But all throughout the whole thing, you've got this focus in the celebration of romance. So my practical advice to all you married men or soon-to-be married men, you need to understand that romance is something that you cultivate and you celebrate as an ongoing, not just on the wedding night, not just in the dating phase, but it's at every phase of the relationship that you have with your one true love. That's your wife, soon-to-be wife. You're going to celebrate the romance. You're going to learn how to do that. Everybody's wired differently, and you talk about love languages or whatever. You're going to figure that out and make it work, and it's going to be the ongoing celebration. That's my point. And to celebrate romance, you have the caricature here, painted or drawn or expressed from the literal translation or reading of chapter 4, verse 1 and following. And this is the famous, "How beautiful you are, my darling, how beautiful you are. Your eyes are like doves behind your veil. Your hair is like a flock of goats that have descended from Mount Gilead. Your teeth are like a flock of newly shorn ewes, which have come up from their washing. All of them which bear twins, and not one of them has lost her young. Your lips are like scarlet thread, and your mouth is lovely. Your temples are like a slice of pomegranate behind your veil. Your neck is like the Tower of David." So all of the description is painted out in this Song of Solomon for the beautiful. And you have to understand, in language of the 8th to 7th century BC, this woman described here was a fox. She was beautiful. So one of the things, and I've given you full disclosure here, this poem that I wrote my wife. I mean, you can come up with, and I challenged a Sunday school class that I taught to do this, is to write a poem to your wife that celebrates the romance. And, this, I've given it to you here in the notes. I think you're beautiful. I know you don't think so, and tell me as such. You ask in the mirror, and it may not tell you so much, but I think you're beautiful. I think you're beautiful, and the care you give our kids on the way out the door, and the food that you buy at the Aldi store. I think you're beautiful. I'll let you read that, but you can come up with your own more modern way of describing the beauty that you see in your mate. And this goes both ways. You girls can do this, and guys have a way of responding to how their one true love describes their their handsomeness, or as we say in class, goodlierness, right? That's really what we're celebrating here. Beauty or handsomeness or goodlierness. All right, well, we just finished all the wisdom books, and we've got 50 minutes, and that's pretty good. I was trying to be under an hour. So please enjoy this, and do your theological journals, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.